Robert Burns.
Robert Burns was a Scottish poet and lyricist. He is widely regarded as the national poet of Scotland and is celebrated worldwide. He is the best known of the poets who have written in the Scots language, although much of his writing is also in English and a light Scots dialect, accessible to an audience beyond Scotland. He also wrote in Standard English, and in these writings his political or civil commentary is often at its bluntest. He is regarded as a pioneer of the Romantic movement, and after his death he became a great source of inspiration to the founders of both liberalism and socialism, and a cultural icon in Scotland and among the Scottish diaspora around the world. Celebration of his life and work became almost a national charismatic cult during the 19th and 20th centuries, and his influence has long been strong on Scottish literature. In 2009 he was chosen as the greatest Scot by the Scottish public in a vote run by Scottish television channel STV. As well as making original compositions, Burns also collected folk songs from across Scotland, often revising or adapting them. His poem, and song, Auld Lang Syne is often sung at Hogmanay, the last day of the year, and Scots Hahi served for a long time as an unofficial national anthem of the country. Other poems and songs of Burns that remain well known across the world today include A Red, Red Rose, A Man's a Man for a' That, To a Louse, To a Mouse, The Battle of Sharamu, Tam O'Shanter, and E Fon Kiss.
Ayrshire. Alloway.
Burns was born 2 miles, 3 kilometres, south of Ayr, in Alloway, Ayrshire, Scotland, the eldest of the 7 children of William Burns, 1721–1784. Robert Burns spelled his surname Burns until 1786, a self-educated tenant farmer from Dunnottar, the Mearns, and Agnes Brown, or Brown, 1732–1820, the daughter of a tenant farmer from Kirkoswald, Ayrshire. He was born in a house built by his father, now the Burns Cottage Museum, where he lived until Easter 1766, when he was 7 years old. William Burns sold the house and took the tenancy of the 70-acre, 280,000 m2, Mount Elephant Farm, southeast of Alloway. Here Burns grew up in poverty and hardship, and the severe manual labour of the farm left its traces in a premature stoop and a weakened constitution. He had little regular schooling and got much of his education from his father, who taught his children reading, writing, arithmetic, geography, and history, and also wrote for the May Manual of Christian Belief. He was also taught by John Murdoch, 1747–1824, who opened an adventures school in Alloway in 1763 and taught Latin, French, and mathematics to both Robert and his brother Gilbert, 1760–1827, from 1765 to 1768 until Murdoch left the parish. After a few years of home education, Burns was sent to Dalrymple Parish School during the summer of 1772 before returning at harvest time to full-time farm labouring until 1773, when he was sent to lodge with Murdoch for 3 weeks to study grammar, French, and Latin. By the age of 15, Burns was the principal labourer at Mount Elephant. During the harvest of 1774, he was assisted by Nellie Kilpatrick, 1759–1820, who inspired his first attempt at poetry, Oh, Once I Loved a Bonny Lass. In the summer of 1775, he was sent to finish his education with a tutor at Kirkoswald, where he met Peggy Thompson, b. 1762, to whom he wrote 2 songs, Now Westlin Wines, and I Dream Od I Lay.
Tarbolton.
Despite his ability and character, William Burns was consistently unfortunate, and migrated with his large family from farm to farm without ever being able to improve his circumstances. At Whitsun, 1777, he removed his large family from the unfavourable conditions of Mount Elephant to the 130-acre, 0.53 km 2, farm at Lochlear, near Tarbolton, where they stayed until William Burns' death in 1784. Subsequently, the family became integrated into the community of Tarbolton. To his father's disapproval, Robert joined a country dancing school in 1779 and, with Gilbert, formed the Tarbolton Bachelors' Club the following year. His earliest existing letters date from this time, when he began making romantic overtures to Alison Begbie, b. 1762. In spite of 4 songs written for her and a suggestion that he was willing to marry her, she rejected him. Robert Burns was initiated into Masonic Lodge St. David, Tarbolton, on July 4, 1781, when he was 22. In December 1781, Burns moved temporarily to Irvine, Ayrshire, to learn to become a flax dresser, but during the workers' celebrations for New Year 1781/1782, which included Burns as a participant, the flax shop caught fire and was burned to the ground. This venture accordingly came to an end, and Burns went home to Locklear Farm. During this time he met and befriended Captain Richard Brown, who encouraged him to become a poet. He continued to write poems and songs and began a commonplace book in 1783, while his father fought a legal dispute with his landlord. The case went to the Court of Session, and Burns was upheld in January 1784, a fortnight before he died.
Watchline.
Robert and Gilbert made an ineffectual struggle to keep on the farm, but after its failure they moved to the farm at Moseskill, near Watchline, in March, which they maintained with an uphill fight for the next 4 years. During the summer of 1784 Burns came to know a group of girls known collectively as the Belles of Watchline, one of whom was Jean Armour, the daughter of a stonemason from Watchline.
Love affairs.
His first child, Elizabeth Patten Burns, 1785–1817, was born to his mother's servant, Elizabeth Patten, 1760 circa 1799, while he was embarking on a relationship with Jean Armour, who became pregnant with twins in March 1786. Burns signed a paper attesting his marriage to Jean, but her father was in the greatest distress, and fainted away. To avoid disgrace, her parents sent her to live with her uncle in Paisley. Although Armour's father initially forbade it, they were eventually married in 1788. Armour bore him 9 children, only 3 of whom survived infancy. Burns was in financial difficulties due to his want of success in farming, and to make enough money to support a family he took up a friend's offer of work in Jamaica, at a salary of Rs 30 per annum. The position that Burns accepted was as a bookkeeper on a slave plantation. Burns's egalitarian views were typified by the slaves' lament 6 years later, but in 1786 there was little public awareness of the abolitionist movement that began about that time. At about the same time, Burns fell in love with Mary Campbell, 1763–1786, whom he had seen in church while he was still living in Tarbolton. She was born near Dunoon and had lived in Campbelltown before moving to work in Ayrshire. He dedicated the poems The Highland Lassie O, Highland Mary, and To Mary in Heaven to her. His song Will Ye Go to the Indies, My Mary, and Leave All Scotia's Shore? Suggests that they planned to emigrate to Jamaica together. Their relationship has been the subject of much conjecture, and it has been suggested that on May 14, 1786 they exchanged Bibles and plighted their troth over the water of Fale in a traditional form of marriage. Soon afterwards Mary Campbell left her work in Ayrshire, went to the seaport of Greenock, and sailed home to her parents in Campbelltown. In October 1786 Mary and her father sailed from Campbelltown to visit her brother in Greenock. Her brother fell ill with typhus, which she also caught while nursing him. She died of typhus on 20th or 21st October 1786 and was buried there.
Kilmarnock edition.
As Burns lacked the funds to pay for his passage to the West Indies, Gavin Hamilton suggested that he should publish his poems in the meantime by subscription, as a likely way of getting a little money to provide him more liberally in necessaries for Jamaica. On April 3 Burns sent proposals for publishing his Scotch poems to John Wilson, a local printer in Kilmarnock, who published these proposals on April 14, 1786, on the same day that Jean Armour's father tore up the paper in which Burns attested his marriage to Jean. To obtain a certificate that he was a free bachelor, Burns agreed on June 25 to stand for rebuke in Watchline Kirk for 3 Sundays. He transferred his share in Moseskiel Farm to his brother Gilbert on July 22, and on July 30 wrote to tell his friend John Richmond that, "Armour has got a warrant to throw me in jail until I can find a warrant for an enormous sum. I am wandering from one friend's house to another." On July 31, 1786, John Wilson published the volume of works by Robert Burns, poems, chiefly in the Scottish dialect. Known as the Kilmarnock volume, it sold for 3 shillings and contained much of his best writing, including The Twa Dogs, addressed to the Dail, Halloween, The Cotter's Saturday Night, To a Mouse, Epitaph for James Smith, and To a Mountain Daisy, many of which had been written at Moseskiel Farm. The success of the work was immediate, and soon he was known across the country. Burns postponed his planned emigration to Jamaica on September 1, and was at Moseskiel 2 days later when he learned that Jean Armour had given birth to twins. On September 4 Thomas Blacklock wrote a letter expressing admiration for the poetry in the Kilmarnock volume, and suggesting an enlarged second edition. A copy of it was passed to Burns, who later recalled, "I had taken the last farewell of my few friends, my chest was on the road to Greenock. I had composed the last song I should ever measure in Scotland. The gloomy night is gathering fast when a letter from Dr. Blacklock to a friend of mine overthrew all my schemes, by opening new prospects to my poetic ambition." The doctor belonged to a set of critics for whose applause I had not dared to hope. His opinion that I would meet with encouragement in Edinburgh for a second edition, fired me so much, that away I posted for that city, without a single acquaintance, or a single letter of introduction.
Edinburgh.
On November 27, 1786, Burns borrowed a pony and set out for Edinburgh. On December 14 William Creech issued subscription bills for the first Edinburgh edition of poems, chiefly in the Scottish dialect, which was published on April 17, 1787. Within a week of this event, Burns has sold his copyright to Creech for 100 guineas. For the edition, Creech commissioned Alexander Nasmyth to paint the oval bust-length portrait now in the Scottish National Portrait Gallery, which was engraved to provide a frontispiece for the book. Nasmyth had got to know Burns, and his fresh and appealing image has become the basis for almost all subsequent representations of the poet. In Edinburgh, he was received as an equal by the city's men of letters, including Dugald Stewart, Robertson, Blair and others, and was a guest at aristocratic gatherings, where he bore himself with unaffected dignity. Here he encountered, and made a lasting impression on, the 16-year-old Walter Scott, who described him later with great admiration. The new edition of his poems brought Burns PS 400. His stay in the city also resulted in some lifelong friendships, among which were those with Lord Glenelg, and Francis-Iana Dunlop, 1730–1815, who became his occasional sponsor and with whom he corresponded for many years until a rift developed. He embarked on a relationship with the separated Agnes Nancy Micklehose, 1758–1841, with whom he exchanged passionate letters under pseudonyms. Burns called himself Sylvander, and Nancy Clorinda. When it became clear that Nancy would not be easily seduced into a physical relationship, Burns moved on to Jenny Clow, 1766–1792, Nancy's domestic servant, who bore him a son, Robert Burns Clow, in 1788. He also had an affair with a servant girl, Margaret May Cameron. His relationship with Nancy concluded in 1791 with a final meeting in Edinburgh before she sailed to Jamaica for what turned out to be a short-lived reconciliation with her estranged husband. Before she left, he sent her the manuscript of Ye Fond Kiss as a farewell. In Edinburgh, in early 1787, he met James Johnson, a struggling music engraver and music seller with a love of old Scots songs and a determination to preserve them. Burns shared this interest and became an enthusiastic contributor to the Scots Musical Museum. The first volume was published in 1787 and included 3 songs by Burns. He contributed 40 songs to Volume 2, and he ended up responsible for about a third of the 600 songs in the whole collection, as well as making a considerable editorial contribution. The final volume was published in 1803.
Dumfriesshire. A Lisland farm.
On his return from Edinburgh in February 1788 he resumed his relationship with Jean Armour and took a lease on Hill Island Farm, Dumfriesshire, settling there in June. He also trained as a gauger or exciseman in case farming continued to be unsuccessful. He was appointed to duties in customs and excise in 1789 and eventually gave up the farm in 1791. Meanwhile, in November 1790, he had written Tam O'Shanter. About this time he was offered and declined an appointment in London on the staff of the Star newspaper, and refused to become a candidate for a newly created chair of agriculture in the University of Edinburgh, although influential friends offered to support his claims.
Lyricist.
After giving up his farm he removed to Dumfries. It was at this time that, being requested to write lyrics for the melodies of Scotland, he responded by contributing over 100 songs. He made major contributions to George Thomson's A Select Collection of Original Scottish Airs for the Voice as well as to James Johnson's Scots Musical Museum. Arguably his claim to immortality chiefly rests on these volumes, which placed him in the front rank of lyric poets. Burns described how he had to master singing the tune before he composed the words. Burns also worked to collect and preserve Scottish folk songs, sometimes revising, expanding, and adapting them. One of the better known of these collections is The Merry Muses of Caledonia. The title is not Burns's, a collection of bawdy lyrics that were popular in the music halls of Scotland as late as the 20th century. Many of Burns's most famous poems are songs with the music based upon older traditional songs. For example, Auld Lang Syne is set to the traditional tune Can Ye Labour Lee, a red rose is set to the tune of Major Graham, and the Battle of Sharamur is set to the Cameronian Rant.
Failing health and death.
Burns's worldly prospects were perhaps better than they had ever been. But he had become soured, and moreover he had alienated many of his best friends by too freely expressing sympathy with the French Revolution and the then unpopular advocates of reform at home. His political views also came to the notice of his employers, and in an attempt to prove his loyalty to the Crown, Burns joined the Royal Dumfries Volunteers in March 1795. As his health began to give way, he began to age prematurely and fell into fits of despondency. The habits of intemperance, alleged mainly by temperance activist James Curry, are said to have aggravated his long-standing possible rheumatic heart condition. His death followed a dental extraction in winter 1795. On the morning of July 21, 1796 Burns died in Dumfries, at the age of 37. The funeral took place on Monday 25 July 1796, the day that his son Maxwell was born. He was at first buried in the far corner of St. Michael's Churchyard in Dumfries. A simple slab of freestone was erected as his gravestone by Jean Armour, which some felt insulting to his memory. His body was eventually moved to its final location in the same cemetery, the Burns Mausoleum, in September 1815. The body of his widow Jean Armour was buried with his in 1834. Armour had taken steps to secure his personal property, partly by liquidating two promissory notes amounting to £15 sterling, about £1,100 at 2009 prices. The family went to the Court of Session in 1798 with a plan to support his surviving children by publishing a 4-volume edition of his complete works and a biography written by Dr. James Curry. Subscriptions were raised to meet the initial cost of publication, which was in the hands of Thomas Cadell and William Davis in London and William Creech, bookseller in Edinburgh. Hogg records that fundraising for Burns's family was embarrassingly slow, and it took several years to accumulate significant funds through the efforts of John Sim and Alexander Cunningham. Burns was posthumously given the freedom of the town of Dumfries. Hogg records that Burns was given the freedom of the burgh of Dumfries on June 4, 1787, 9 years before his death, and was also made an honorary burgess of Dumfries. Through his 12 children, Burns has over 600 living descendants as of 2012.
Literary style.
Burns's style is marked by spontaneity, directness, and sincerity, and ranges from the tender intensity of some of his lyrics through the humour of Tam O'Shanter, and the satire of Holy Willie's Prayer, and the Holy Fair. Burns's poetry drew upon a substantial familiarity with a knowledge of classical, biblical, and English literature, as well as the Scottish Macau tradition. Burns was skilled in writing not only in the Scots language but also in the Scottish English dialect of the English language. Some of his works, such as Love and Liberty, also known as The Jolly Beggars, are written in both Scots and English for various effects. His themes included republicanism, he lived during the French Revolutionary period, and radicalism, which he expressed covertly in Scots haughty, Scottish patriotism, anti-clericalism, class inequalities, gender roles, commentary on the Scottish Kirk of his time, Scottish cultural identity, poverty, sexuality, and the beneficial aspects of popular socializing, carousing, Scotch whisky, folk songs, and so forth. The strong emotional highs and lows associated with many of Burns's poems have led some, such as Burns' biographer Robert Crawford, to suggest that he suffered from manic depression, a hypothesis that has been supported by analysis of various samples of his handwriting. Burns himself referred to suffering from episodes of what he called blue devilism. However, the National Trust for Scotland has downplayed the suggestion in the grounds that evidence is insufficient to support the claim.
Influence. Britain.
Burns is generally classified as a proto-romantic poet, and he influenced William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and Percy Bysshe Shelley greatly. His direct literary influences in the use of Scots in poetry were Allan Ramsay and Robert Fergusson. The Edinburgh literati worked to sentimentalise Burns during his life and after his death, dismissing his education by calling him a heaven-taught ploughman. Burns influenced later Scottish writers, especially Hugh MacDiarmid, who fought to dismantle what he felt had become a sentimental cult that dominated Scottish literature.
Canada.
Burns had a significant influence on Alexander MacLachlan and some influence on Robert Service. While this may not be so obvious in Service's English verse, which is Kiplingesque, it is more readily apparent in his Scots verse. Scottish Canadians have embraced Robert Burns as a kind of patron poet and mark his birthday with festivities. Robbie Burns Day is celebrated from Newfoundland and Labrador to Nanaimo. Every year, Canadian newspapers publish biographies of the poet, listings of local events and buffet menus. Universities mark the date in a range of ways. McMaster University Library organised a special collection and Simon Fraser University's Centre for Scottish Studies organised a marathon reading of Burns' poetry. Senator Heath Macquarie quipped of Canada's first Prime Minister that while the lovable Burns went in for wine, women and song, his fellow Scot, John A. did not chase women and was not musical. Gung Haggis Fat Choi is a hybrid of Chinese New Year and Robbie Burns Day, celebrated in Vancouver since the late 1990s.
United States.
In January 1864, President Abraham Lincoln was invited to attend a Robert Burns celebration by Robert Crawford. And if unable to attend, send a toast. Lincoln composed a toast. An example of Burns's literary influence in the U.S. is seen in the choice by novelist John Steinbeck of the title of his 1937 novel, Of Mice and Men, taken from a line in the second-to-last stanza of To a Mouse the Best Laid Schemes O Mice and Men / Gang Aft Eggley. Burns's influence on American vernacular poets such as James Whitcomb Riley and Frank Lebby Stanton has been acknowledged by their biographers. When asked for the source of his greatest creative inspiration, singer-songwriter Bob Dylan selected Burns's 1794 song A Red, Red Rose as the lyric that had the biggest effect on his life. The author J.D. Salinger used protagonist Holden Caulfield's misinterpretation of Burns' poem Comin' Through the Rye as his title and a main interpretation of Caulfield's grasping to his childhood in his 1951 novel The Catcher in the Rye. The poem, actually about a rendezvous, is thought by Caulfield to be about saving people from falling out of childhood.
Russia.
Burns became the people's poet of Russia. In Imperial Russia, Burns was translated into Russian and became a source of inspiration for the ordinary, oppressed Russian people. In Soviet Russia, he was elevated as the archetypal poet of the people. As a great admirer of the egalitarian ethos behind the American and French revolutions, who expressed his own egalitarianism in poems such as his birthday ode for George Washington, or his Is There for Honest Poverty, commonly known as A Man's a Man for That, Burns was well placed for endorsement by the communist regime as a progressive artist. A new translation of Burns begun in 1924 by Samuel Marshak proved enormously popular, selling over 600,000 copies. The USSR honored Burns with a commemorative stamp in 1956. He remains popular in Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union.
Honors. Landmarks and organizations.
Burns clubs have been founded worldwide. The first one, known as the Mother Club, was founded in Greenock in 1801 by merchants born in Ayrshire, some of whom had known Burns. The club set its original objectives as to cherish the name of Robert Burns, to foster a love of his writings, and generally to encourage an interest in the Scottish language and literature. The club also continues to have local charitable work as a priority. Burns's birthplace in Alloway is now a public museum known as Burns Cottage. His house in Dumfries is operated as the Robert Burns House, and the Robert Burns Centre in Dumfries features more exhibits about his life and works. Island Farm in Aldgirth, which he owned from 1788 to 1791, is maintained as a working farm with a museum and interpretation centre by the Friends of Island Farm. Significant 19th-century monuments to him stand in Alloway, Edinburgh, and Dumfries. An early 20th-century replica of his birthplace cottage belonging to the Burns Club Atlanta stands in Atlanta, Georgia. These are part of a large list of Burns memorials and statues around the world. Organisations include the Robert Burns Fellowship of the University of Otago in New Zealand, and the Burns Club Atlanta in the United States. Towns named after Burns include Burns, New York, and Burns, Oregon. In the suburb of Summerhill, Dumfries, the majority of the streets have names with Burns connotations. A BR Standard Class 7 steam locomotive was named after him, along with a later British Rail Class 87 electric locomotive, number 87035. On September 24, 1996, Class 156 Diesel Unit 156,433 was named the Kilmarnock Edition by Jimmy Knapp, General Secretary of the RMT Union, at Girvan Station to launch the new Burns Line services between Girvan, Ayr, and Kilmarnock, supported by Strathclyde Passenger Transport, SPT. Several streets surrounding the Frederick Law Olmsted, Jr.'s Black Bay Fens in Boston, Massachusetts, were designated with Burns connotations. A life-size statue was dedicated in Burns's honor within the Black Bay Fens of the West Fenway neighborhood in 1912. It stood until 1972 when it was relocated downtown, sparking protests from the neighborhood, literary fans, and preservationists of Olmsted's vision for the Black Bay Fens. There is a statue of Burns in the Octagon, Dunedin, in the same pose as the one in Dundee. Dunedin's first European settlers were Scots. Thomas Burns, a nephew of Burns, was one of Dunedin's founding fathers. A crater on Mercury is named after Burns. In November 2012, Burns was awarded the title Honorary Chartered Surveyor by the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, the only posthumous membership so far granted by the institution.
Stamps and currency.
The Soviet Union was the first country in the world to honor Burns with a commemorative stamp, marking the 160th anniversary of his death in 1956. The Royal Mail has issued postage stamps commemorating Burns 3 times. In 1966, 2 stamps were issued, priced 4p and 1 shilling and 3p, both carrying Burns's portrait. In 1996, an issue commemorating the bicentenary of his death comprised 4 stamps, priced 19p, 25p, 41p and 60p, and including quotes from Burns's poems. On January 22, 2009, 2 stamps were issued by the Royal Mail to commemorate the 250th anniversary of Burns's birth. Burns was pictured on the Clydesdale Bank PS5 note from 1971 to 2009. On the reverse of the note was a vignette of a field mouse and a wild rose in reference to Burns's poem To a Mouse. The Clydesdale Bank's notes were redesigned in 2009 and, since then, he has been pictured on the front of their PS10 note. In September 2007, the Bank of Scotland redesigned their banknotes to feature famous Scottish bridges. The reverse side of new PS5 features Brig O'Doon, famous from Burns's poem Tam O'Shanter, and pictures the statue of Burns at that site. In 1996 the Isle of Man issued a 4-coin set of crown, 5/ pieces on the themes of Auld Lang Syne, Edinburgh Castle, Revenue Cutter, and writing poems. Tristan da Cunha produced a gold PS5 bicentenary coin. In 2009 the Royal Mint issued a commemorative £2 coin featuring a quote from Auld Lang Syne.
Musical tributes.
In 1976 singer Jean Reid Puff, in collaboration with composer Serge Hovey, started to record all of Burns' songs, with a mixture of traditional and Burns' own compositions. The project ended when Hovey died, after 7 of the planned 22 volumes were completed. Reid Puff also recorded 4 cassettes of Burns' songs, reissued as 3 CDs, for the Scots Musical Museum. In 1996 a musical about Burns's life called Red Red Rose won 3rd place at a competition for new musicals in Denmark. Robert Burns was played by John Barrowman. On January 25, 2008, a musical play about the love affair between Robert Burns and Nancy McElhose entitled Clorinda premiered in Edinburgh before touring Scotland. Clorinda will make its American premiere in Atlantic Beach, Florida at Atlantic Beach Experimental Theatre on January 25, 2013. Eddie Reader has released 2 albums, Sings the Songs of Robert Burns and the Songs of Robert Burns Deluxe Edition, about the work of the poet.
Burns Suppers.
Burns Night, in effect a second National Day, is celebrated on Burns's birthday, January 25, with Burns suppers around the world, and is more widely observed in Scotland than the official National Day, St Andrew's Day. The first Burns supper in the Mother Club in Greenock was held on what was thought to be his birthday on January 29, 1802. In 1803 it was discovered from the Ayr Parish records that the correct date was January 25, 1759. The format of Burns suppers has changed little since. The basic format starts with a general welcome and announcements, followed with a Selkirk race. After the grace comes the piping and cutting of the haggis, when Burns's famous address to a haggis is read and the haggis is cut open. The event usually allows for people to start eating just after the haggis is presented. At the end of the meal a series of toasts and replies is made. This is when the toast to the immortal memory, an overview of Burns's life and work, is given. The event usually concludes with the singing of Auld Lang Syne.
Greatest Scot.
In 2009, STV ran a television series and public vote on who was the greatest Scot. On St Andrew's Day, STV announced that Robert Burns had been voted the greatest Scot of all time, narrowly beating William Wallace.